Hello there. In this series of videos I'm going to talk about using Fluid Designer for 3D printing, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks of what to do and what not to do when using Fluid Designer for 3D printing to make life easy for yourself. And I really would strongly advise that you watch all of the videos in this particular series. Now the first thing that I'm going to talk about is that all of the files that come preloaded with Fluid Designer for 3D printing, whether or not you've just downloaded it for free or whether you've actually purchased our full set of files, our parametric design software, treat all of the files that are preloaded as template files. Try never to use file and save when working with Fluid Designer for 3D printing, because you will write on top of what are essentially template files. So if I load up Fluid Designer for 3D printing, so on your system, you might have Harrington fonts, for example. You've probably just got A, B and C if you've downloaded the free version, but the rest of them come with the paid version. So all of these objects here, it is best to leave them as they are on your system, unless you find a fault with them, and occasionally you will do that. Try not to go to File and Save when working with Fluid Designer. If you're going to do Save As. That's particularly true if you're going to, for example, create a pendant. So if you're going to use this 20mm hexagonal pendant object, for example, you don't want to be adding bits to this and creating a pendant and then going to File and Save, because you'll write on top of the original file on the system, and you don't want to be doing that. You want to keep a blank 20mm hexagonal pendant to use again in the future. Alright, so that's the first point that I want to make when using Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Be very careful when going to File. Use Save As, or better still, just export it as an OBJ or as an STL file. Now the next thing I want to talk about is keep, wherever possible, try and keep all of your objects as curves. Try not to convert things to meshes. It's not necessary in Fluid Designer for 3D printing, because when you use the export command, when you export as an OBJ or as an STL file, that will convert it to a mesh for you. So let me just show you what happens. So if we take this object here, for example, if I just snap that to the center, and let me just snap another one to the center, and I'll snap that to the center as well. That's a bit too long, that one, so let me just delete that one and snap that to the center. Still a bit too long. It's better. So I'm just going to hold down the shift key there and join those three objects that I've just placed in the center of the screen together, and Tools, Objects, and join them together. So there's my pendant, and let me just assume that that's the pendant design that I want. Okay, so I started off by saying never go to File and Save. If you do that, then you'll have to delete these three objects, the circle and the square and the line, in future if you want to use this hexagonal pendant. So it's not a good idea to do that. If you want to save this, go to File and Save As, and I usually save them on the desktop as kind of temporary files while I'm working, and I just delete master and delete the number, and I save that as a Blender file. Now if I just open up my file manager, and I probably just need to refresh this just to have a look at the file that I've just saved. Yeah, there's the Blender file. It's the 20mm hexagonal pendant, and notice it's only 765 kilobits. So it's a very, very small document. So that's one advantage of keeping them as curves. But the other thing is that we can now if we've saved the file like that, at some future point in time, if I wanted to edit this, I could edit it and I could change the appearance of my pendant and redesign it quite simply and quite easily. If you change this to a mesh, you are a bit more restricted. You won't, for example, be able to use the smart facility here of changing the cross section. So you'll be limited in what you can actually do if you converted this to a mesh. Now what I'm going to do now is I am going to convert this to a mesh to just show you what actually happens. So if I convert that to a mesh, my bevel objects and curve objects disappear from over here, so I can't change that cross section anymore. And if I just go to save as again, and I'm going to give this a different name, I'm going to type mesh here so to distinguish between the two. Remember the curve one, this is the one I recommend you keep it as, is 764. When I save that as a mesh, if I just refresh the screen again, you'll see that the mesh is 10,506 kilobits. Well, you know, you're going to save a lot of disk space by keeping things as curves rather than having them as meshes. But as I've said, it's not necessary, because if I just do Control Z and undo that, take this back to a curve again, when I go to File and Export, and it doesn't matter whether it's an OBJ or an STL file, when I export this curve as an OBJ file, one of the things that will happen is that these operators here will convert it to a mesh. It's a 20mm hexagonal pendant, and when I export it as an OBJ file, it's actually converting the curve to a mesh as it exports the OBJ file. But when it returns to the main document, when you're still in Fluid Designer, this is still a curve. But if I go to Netfabb Basic, and if I go to Project and Open, what we'll find is the 20mm hexagonal pendant. When I open up that, well, you can see actually it's 10,000 kilobits again. So the file size is the file size of a mesh. So you don't need to convert things to meshes when working with Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Just export them as OBJ or STL files. And we always recommend you go to Netfabb Basic and just run through the repair procedure there, and you'll see that the edge problems and the holes will be just fixed for you with Netfabb Basic. So you always do need to do that anyway. Alright, so try and remember, keep your objects as curves, and if in doubt, if you just remove the bevel object, you can see where the curve is there. That's the curve function in the background, and the bevel object is just the cross section that's wrapped around that curve. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is the group library button, which is in the browser panel, and you need to quite often click this to refresh the file or the folder list. On my system, because I'm using it all the time, most of the folders that I've created appear on this file list here. But if I actually go to, say, earrings, and if I open up an earring document, when I click over here, notice that this list is much smaller now, and this is the list of folders on the system that were on my system when this file itself was created. If I go back to File and New, these are all the folders on my system with all the various patterns that I've created to date now. But as I've just said, if I open that 10mm earring there, when this object was first created on my system, I only have these folders on my network. Now, if you want to see all the folders on your system, click Group Library, and that will refresh the list. And you'll see when I do that, I've got all the patterns, all the folders that are on my system, and it will also refresh any objects here as well. So if there are no objects listed here, click Group Library and then just switch to the folder that you want, and you'll see all the files on your system. And as you open things and save them, it will update this for you. But that's just a feature of this application. It's the way Blender works essentially. When you create a file like this one, let me just do it again, open up recent one. When you create this, as well as saving the different panels that are open, Blender actually saves this information as well. So you do need to refresh the file list and the folder list by clicking the Group Library button. Very important to just do that, and it's right next to here anyway, so it's quite easy to actually do. Okay, now one other thing that I want to talk about in this particular video is applying the scale. This is absolutely vital that you follow this, and you do this every single time you scale a curve. And it's also probably a good habit to get into when you scale meshes in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. But it's absolutely vital to apply the scale when you're scaling curves in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Otherwise your objects will not be parametric smart objects anymore. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at this object here at the moment, the cross section of it is 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. So that's 1 millimeter there and 1 millimeter deep. Now if I just open up the toolbox here, and if I just switch on screencast keys, if I scale this object, and remember this object is a curve at the moment, if I just delete that you can see the curve there. Okay, if I scale this object up, alright, that is not 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter anymore. It's actually the depth, the Z dimension is now 2.4. It's 2.4 times the size it was before. But in the properties panel, this cross section here is still saying it's 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. Now what's happening is that when you scale in Fluid Designer, you have a resize vector. We've actually scaled this up by 2.4 times its original size, which is why this Z value is 2.4 as well. And if we were to measure the thickness at the top here, this would also be 2.4 millimeters. Now, whenever you do scale in Fluid Designer for 3D printing, you must always hold down the Control key and press A and apply the scale. Now, when I do that, these will be set back to 1, and this thickness will change. So just watch that object as I do Control A and apply the scale. Now the values here disappear, but there is a tick in the scale box, but you can see this thickness changed, and it's now back to its true value, 1 millimeter. So from the point of view of 3D printing, it's absolutely vital that that scale factor is set back to 1, and that this value here of 1 millimeter corresponds with the bevel object here in the curve data properties window. If you don't scale it back and you continue to work, any new cross section that you apply here will be wrong. It isn't wrong now, as you can see. That's now 2 millimeters deep because I've changed it to 2 millimeters. If I change it to 2 by 2, it's still 2 millimeters deep, but it's also 2 millimeters across there now. So let me just set it back to 1 by 1. So I'm going to scale it down. And as you can see, I've done it half scale now. So it's gone down to a thickness of 0.5. Here, a depth I should say of 0.5. This is telling me that it should be 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. It isn't. but I can repair that. I can set the vector back to 1 by doing Control A and applying the scale, and notice the thickness of it goes back now to 1 millimeter. So whenever you scale a curve in Fluid Designer for 3D printing, in order to know exactly what your cross-section thickness is, you must always do Control A and apply the scale. If you forget to do it, after that, these values here will be nonsense. You won't be able to guarantee that you know what thickness a particular object is anymore. And from the point of view of 3D printing, it's really important that you know what the thickness is, because there are minimum thicknesses that you can actually print to. So if you upload to Shapeways, for example, generally speaking, you can't go below about 0.8 millimeters or 0.7 millimeters in thickness. So it's really important that you know what this thickness is and that you stick to it. Okay, so in this video, if I just go back to the beginning there, I've just discussed don't use the save command. Yeah, treat all preloaded files as template files. Try and, wherever possible, keep your work as curves. There are times when you can't do that, but wherever possible, try and keep things as curves, because you can modify them more easily in future. And click the Group Library button in the browser panel to refresh the file and folder list. And always, 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 when scaling curves, do Control A and apply the scale. If you don't do that, you won't know what the thickness of your objects is. Okay, so I'm going to finish off this video here, but there is part 2 and part 3, which I recommend that you follow after this. Thank you.